Yes, Game Boy Works is back, but we need to go even further back. Back to the handheld that started it all. The Milton Bradley Microvision on Game Boy Works Gaiden.
The machine inhabitants found it to be one of their own kind. Primitive, yet kindred.
Nintendo's Game Boy, and the Game & Watch before it, really cemented the idea of portable video games as a worthy endeavor, or at least as an appealing waste of time. But Nintendo did not invent that concept by any means. The first true handheld system debuted years before the Game Boy, a full decade, and a year before Game & Watch. Milton Bradley launched the Microvision all the way back in 1979, making it practically Paleolithic as far as video game tech goes. And while it didn't exactly change the world, and certainly never became a hit on the scale of Game Boy, it definitely had its audience and caught the eye of influential people. In fact, former Nintendo designer Satoru Okada has cited their Microvision as a direct inspiration for Game & Watch and Game Boy, at least in some respects. With this little, well, not so little, handheld, Milton Bradley adeptly straddled the line between toy and video game, the same transition that Nintendo would make a couple of years later. Now, it's not like Milton Bradley invented the idea of portable electronic games from thin air. Microvision's designer, Jay Smith, has in turn cited Mattel's portable electronic games from the 1970s as his inspiration for Microvision. Simple as Microvision seems in comparison to the likes of Game Boy, Mattel's handhelds were even more simplistic. They didn't have screens, just arrays of red LEDs that would light up in patterns that loosely resembled some sort of sports activity like baseball or basketball. You could tell which sport you were meant to be playing because the game helpfully arrived in a plastic shell molded to resemble some element of that sport. Mattel LED basketball would probably not have read at basketball if you simply had to control the red lights on a blank black sheet of plastic. But since the LEDs were framed by a faux screen mounted in the center of a large disc styled to resemble an actual basketball, the idea comes across reasonably well. And these games were in turn preceded by battery-operated gadgets that used analog elements like motorized spools of road imagery to create a handheld equivalent to the electromechanical amusements that preceded video games and arcades, and so on and so forth. The history of games is one of constant iteration, inspiration, and imitation. But Microvision represented a pretty significant step forward in the portable gaming format. It brought the Channel F Atari 2600 principle of interchangeable ROM-based cartridges into the handheld space, making use of a proper LCD screen and real computer processors to recreate, or at least approximate, the kind of game experiences you could find on home consoles and in arcades. I stress the word approximate because no console or arcade cabinet in 1979 had to settle for technology this dated. The Microvision may have included an integrated LCD screen, but its monochromatic 16 by 16 pixel grid was in no danger of tricking anyone into thinking it was the real Space Invaders. Space Raiders. The missile-based shields in Space Invaders were 16 by 15 pixels. The Microvision had exactly enough pixel resolution to render one of these, or four of the smallest invaders all jammed together. This device could only create an impressionistic sense of games, and not unlike those Mattel LED handhelds, often relied on the player's familiarity with a game's theme or premise in order to read. And that's fine. Back in the 1970s, kids still had imaginations. They didn't have your YouTubes or TikToks. They had vacuum tubes and sticks and rocks. All of that gloriously painted cover art on Atari 2600 games wasn't really deceptive marketing. It was a helpful guide to indicate what the heck was supposed to be happening on screen. So a name like Star Trek Phaser Strike was a crucial clue for Microvision owners, who would not have looked at that 256 square grid and said, "Ah yes, this is Captain Kirk blasting Klingons," if left to their own devices. The Microvision made use of an unconventional hardware scheme. Well, unconventional in 1979 anyway. A few years later, it became weirdly common, especially among Japanese consoles. Yes, Milton Bradley designed the Microvision hardware with the same mindset that Epoch would use for the CassetteVision and Gaiden would implement for the TV Boy. Namely, the Microvision console itself did not actually contain a processor chip. Those were fitted into the interchangeable cartridges. Not unlike the CassetteVision setup a couple of years later, the Microvision body contained the machine's video system, its power supply, and its controls. Each cartridge housed both the program code and the processor and RAM to make it all work. An odd solution, but one that evidently made the most financial sense in 1979. allowing Milton Bradley to sell their game system for $50, considerably less than you'd have paid for a proper console at the time. The Microvision's implementation of this setup differs considerably from the Epoch and Gaiden approaches. Milton Bradley didn't ship game as cartridges, but rather as faceplates for the machine. On its own, the Microvision looks like it's been stripped for parts. Remove a faceplate, and you see the LCD screen mounted above a frosted plastic housing that covers the internal circuitry. Beneath the screen is a slightly larger plastic membrane. The system can power up when no faceplate is attached, but there's no point to it. Without a CPU and program code, the Microvision can't do anything. And without a faceplate attached, the machine also lacks a full interface. Each game faceplate looks distinct, not just in terms of the title emblazoned on the plate's marquee above the screen and the decorative silk screening around the LCD window, but also in terms of controls. In Europe, Microvision faceplates actually shipped in a variety of different colors instead of the dull black and beige plastics used in the US, because Milton Bradley understood that American consumers are fundamentally boring and terrified of vibrant visuals. In addition to a plastic window to protect the delicate LCD screen from scratches, each faceplate also contained a different array of buttons. These buttons sat above the taupe-colored membrane below the main unit's screen and featured small, raised mounds that would make contact with the membrane when the button above was depressed. The membrane is in fact the Microvision's secondary control interface. Milton Bradley built two hardwired control elements into the handheld. The first of these, a fixed rotary dial, sits permanently below the faceplate and remains available regardless of which game you happen to be playing. However, the membrane offers a degree of flexibility. It can detect touch-based contacts in a 3x4 grid array, which corresponds to the dimples on the interior of each faceplate's lower portion. Developers could set up each faceplate to incorporate any combination of different button arrangements within this 12-square grid, ranging from game option inputs to a makeshift directional pad. Combined with the rotary dial, the customizable input membrane gave Microvision games remarkable flexibility, a whole lot more than you'd really expect for games powered by a 100 kHz processor running at 1-bit 16x16 resolution via 64 bytes of RAM. Functionally, the interface holds its own with the Mattel and Television's combination dial controller and keypad, which debuted the same year. The adaptable control interface goes a long way toward giving the Microvision some real durability. The cartridges also had potential for technical flexibility as well. Since each faceplate contained its own CPU, Milton Bradley's designers had the option of using different processors in order to enable different features. Technically, any system that relied on cart-based CPUs enjoyed this freedom, but to my knowledge, manufacturers like Epoch and Gaiden never took advantage of it. Like CassetteVision and TV Boy always used the same chips to power their games. Milton Bradley, on the other hand, dabbled. Microvision games used two different types of processor throughout its life, a TMS 1100 variant and the Intel 8021. The former offered less processing power, but in turn required less battery power, while the latter presented greater capabilities, but also drained batteries more quickly. In practice, it seemed like Milton Bradley quickly decided to go with the TMS option for most games. The information I found online suggests that only one game ever used the Intel option, Connect 4, and even that card had a running change that downgraded it to the TMS chip. The console itself reflected this change. Early units ran on two 9-volt batteries, but by multiple accounts, the second battery was only really necessary for powering Intel-based faceplates. At some point, Milton Bradley reworked the system to operate on a single battery, though they didn't bother to go to the expense of fully retooling the mold and left the second battery compartment in place as a battery holder. I suppose this means that the original Intel-powered Connect 4 can't run on the revised hardware, but as side effects of running hardware changes go, this is hardly the most devastating loss in video game history. Milton Bradley rolled out the Microvision in November of 1979, with at least 4 games in tow, including the pack-in Blockbuster. All told, 7 of the Microvision's 11 games debuted in 1979, with the other 4 rolling out at unknown times through the end of 1981. Well, technically there were 12 games which shipped through 1982, but more on that later. In any case, it's a pretty slim library, all told, though it's on par with minor platforms of the era like CassetteVision, AdventureVision, and PV-1000. The Microvision seems to have performed reasonably well, but it never became a true hit. The success of Nintendo's Game & Watch probably drove that reality home. Nintendo created Game & Watch in response to the Microvision while addressing that device's shortcomings, its excessive size, its relatively high cost, and its low visual resolution. Game & Watch sold for about the same price as a standard Microvision game and didn't require a base unit, took up far less space, made use of economical and long-lasting watch batteries instead of 9 volts, and used detailed silk-screened visuals instead of a 16 by 16 pixel grid. Milton Bradley evidently floated plans for a color model, but eventually decided to give up, leaving a hole in the US gaming market in the shape of a cartridge-based portable console for the duration of the 1980s. But at least we have our memories. And leftover units, which remain inexpensive and easily collectible. Now, finding a unit without LCD screen rot, well, that's the real challenge, isn't it? At least the screens are fairly easily replaced, and fans have even created backlit mods, like the one I'm using for recording this little miniseries. So let's take a journey through the Microvision library. A library as small as the Microvision is large. We begin, naturally enough, with the pack-in title, a little thing called Blockbuster. With Blockbuster, you can see the classic hardware pack-in conundrum in action. Do you ship a game that's bound to sell well in with the console itself to showcase the hardware straight away and boost sales? Or do you reserve that surefire hit as a standalone release in order to rack up extra income? Milton Bradley took the former approach, shipping Microvision with the Blockbuster faceplate that simply clones Atari's Breakout in monochrome. This may seem a fairly obvious choice in hindsight, especially considering that this is one of the few truly compelling games for the system, but at the time I have to imagine the business calculus was more complex. Breakout was still a pretty popular title in 1979, having only just been supplanted by Space Invaders as the new hotness. The concept of a portable rendition of Breakout, controlled with an actual rotary knob, must have been pretty compelling. Blockbuster seems like an easy win, the cartridge that everyone would have inevitably picked up with their new Microvision console. But Milton Bradley arranged things so that they didn't need to. The game came alongside every new system, making it an even more attractive purchase. As portable takes on Breakout Go, Blockbuster does about as good a job as you could expect on a device as underpowered as Microvision. It recreates the solitaire Pong design of Atari's original neatly, giving players a ball, a paddle, and several rows of bricks running along the top of the screen. You slide your paddle left and right to prevent the ball from dropping down to the bottom of the screen, where it will be lost, as you try to deflect the ball into the bricks in order to break them. Bust them. Your paddle, by default, consists of a 3-pixel line. The ball reacts differently depending on which pixel it hits. The center pixel causes the ball to bounce directly upward, while each of the side pixels cause it to bounce away at a 45-degree angle in that direction. Given the low resolution and simple physics at work here, Blockbuster is an awfully simplistic take on this design. It's pretty easy to get the ball locked into a groove as you struggle to clear away bricks that you simply cannot get a good angle on. Nintendo's Alleyway, the Game Boy's equivalent of Blockbuster 10 years later, would remediate this issue by causing the ball to automatically switch angles after a few locked bounces. Microvision doesn't really have the resolution to make anything but 90 and 45-degree angles read correctly, so this is just an unavoidable quirk of the hardware. Blockbuster is hard enough on its own that it doesn't need to be more difficult. You certainly can make it more difficult, though, if you hate winning. You can set the paddle to be only 2 pixels wide, you can double the ball speed, and you can give yourself a single ball per play. I refuse to believe that any human could complete a single round of Blockbuster at max difficulty, especially since the game likes to drop the ball from a random spot on screen each time a new ball comes into play. If you miss the drop, which is extremely easy to do, that would be game over right there. Even on standard settings, completing a round of Blockbuster demands real skill and precision. I admit my footage here is pretty rough due to the weird angle I had to sit at in order to film the system's screen, and also because I'm old and not good at video games anymore. But the general consensus among reviewers is that yeah, Blockbuster takes no prisoners. It's hard enough to be difficult to complete, but addictive enough to keep you trying. Not a bad start for portable video gaming, to be honest, and certainly more entertaining than anything available in the handhelds that had come before. And now that we've looked at the system's pack-in, let's look at the last game ever to ship for Microvision. And also, notably, the only game never to ship in the US, Super Blockbuster, which actually isn't all that different from the pack-in game, Blockbuster. Milton Bradley released Microvision in several European territories in addition to the US, and a fair number of US releases never made their way overseas, including Vegas slots and baseball. You know, the most overtly American releases. But only one game failed to show up here after shipping in Europe, and that was 1982's Super Blockbuster. Milton Bradley promoted Super Blockbuster as an upcoming release for America, alongside a game called Barrage that never actually shipped in any region, but in the end it seems that Super Blockbuster arrived on the scene too late to be viable here. That's too bad, Blockbuster and Super Blockbuster make nice bookends for the system. They're the same basic game, but are just different enough to be interesting. I suspect that Super Blockbuster uses a lot of the same programming code as the earlier game, but it makes a single change to alter the entire feel of the action. It moves one of the rows of breakable blocks from the top of the screen to the bottom. The bottom row of blocks becomes the player's new kill line. Rather than trying to prevent the ball from falling off the bottom of the screen, you want to prevent the ball from hitting the bricks beneath your paddle. If the ball breaks through and hits the bottom edge of the screen, the round doesn't end. Instead, the bottom now works like the other edges and sends the ball reflecting back into play. You can't actually lose your ball in this game. Instead, play continues until you either clear the bricks overhead or lose all the bricks in your home row. Once the last piece of the bottom line is destroyed, the game ends and you're scored based on how effectively you cleared away the bricks above. Super Blockbuster lacks the difficulty options of the original Blockbuster, which is fine. The game is tough enough on its own. It also suffers from the same limited physics as the original, which means you can pretty easily get locked into an infinite loop of 45-degree angles that you can't seem to reflect your way out of, turning the process of knocking out those last few blocks into an exercise in tedium. Is it a shame that Super Blockbuster never reached the US? Sure. Would its release in America have changed literally anything besides making it easier for me to find a copy for this video series? Probably not. Wow, what a legacy. Next time on Game Boy Works Gaiden, a look at the rest of the known Microvision launch library.